Hi guys, it's Michelle, and today's video is going to be about people, well, it was going to be about people who have been kidnapped but were found later, but after researching for this video, at least one of these cases were just so long that I had to do a video on its own. So today's video is going to be about the kidnapping of Elizabeth Smart. I thought this was a really interesting series to start because, first of all, I think it's important to share their stories. Obviously, these people had to go through very traumatic circumstances. Obviously, not everybody who gets kidnapped ends up being that lucky to escape or to just make it out alive in general, but there are several cases of people who have been kidnapped but ended up making it out alive or escaping their kidnapper. It's just, there's a lot of stories that are so insane, and I feel like they're very interesting to share. So today's video is going to be, like I said, about Elizabeth Smart, which is probably one of the most famous kidnappings to ever happen in America. This was all over the news, all over everywhere, of people trying to find this girl. Like I said, because obviously you know the title of this video and the point of the series, she did make it out alive, but that doesn't excuse the fact that she had to deal with very traumatic experiences, and my condolences go out to her and her family in general for like having to deal with that. Obviously, like the time apart, but also to Elizabeth Smart for having to deal with the PTSD from something like that. Like, that's such a traumatic, I can't even imagine. But I'm going to be sharing her story today, so let's get into it. Elizabeth Smart was just 14 years old when she was abducted from her Salt Lake City, Utah home on June 5th of 2002. So to preface this entire thing, I'm going to be talking about the actual abduction first, and then what went on while she was in captivity from her end, but also from her parents' perspective, how they ended up finding her. So first of all, like I said, she was kidnapped on the night of June 5th, 2002. It's likely that the kidnapping occurred sometime between 1 a.m. and 2 a.m. It was a little bit confusing because it has to do with Elizabeth Smart's sister. So the Smart family lived in a nice neighborhood in Salt Lake City, Utah with 6 of their children. At around 1 or 2 a.m., a man came into Elizabeth Smart and her 9-year-old sister Mary Catherine's bedroom. So Mary Catherine was awakened by the sound of the abductor coming in, however, she pretended to be asleep. The man was named Bryan Mitchell, and we're going to talk about more information about him later, but that is the person who abducted Elizabeth Smart. So this is all according to Mary Catherine's perspective at this point. She basically heard a man threatening Elizabeth Smart with what she thought was a gun. It was actually a knife. At this time in her bedroom, and she knew that he was going to take Elizabeth with him. Mary Catherine even claims that she heard the abductor tell Elizabeth, after she stubbed her toe and was like, ouch, he told Elizabeth, "You better be quiet and I won't hurt you." And although Mitchell was speaking quietly, obviously, because his intent wasn't to wake up Mary Catherine, this is actually a really important part of the story, is that Mary Catherine believed that she had heard this man's voice before, however, she could not pinpoint where she had heard it. After Elizabeth Smart and Bryan Mitchell Davis left, Mary Catherine waited an undetermined amount of time, but it was possibly up to 2 hours, because just before 4 a.m. she went to wake up her parents and tell her that Elizabeth had been kidnapped. At first they thought that she was dreaming, but obviously they ended up seeing that Elizabeth was missing, and also the screen in her window had been cut with a knife. Obviously that morning, Elizabeth Smart's parents went to go try to not only find Elizabeth, but to alert the entire media that their daughter was missing. So Elizabeth's parents, Ed and Lois Smart, went on television and pleaded for the kidnapper to return their daughter. A massive search was conducted, and it involved over 2,000 volunteers each day searching for Elizabeth Smart, and also involved dogs and planes just trying to find this girl. A huge suspect at the time was Richard Ricci. Richard Ricci was a handyman with a history of drug abuse, and he also worked for the Smarts. This was somebody who everyone thought was guilty. Everyone thought that he actually killed her, which is so sad because he obviously was completely innocent and he didn't kidnap her. Basically in August of 2002, he died of a brain hemorrhage, which is just sad that he died knowing that a lot of people believed that he kidnapped or killed this girl. It's kind of sad in general, but like I said, he was innocent because obviously Bryan Mitchell was the one who kidnapped Elizabeth. Obviously, during the searches for Elizabeth at home in Salt Lake City, Utah, there was actually a lot of traumatizing things going on for Elizabeth Smart. And we're going to talk about some of the things that happened during her captivity, and obviously some of these things are really terrible. So if you are sensitive to that, you might not want to watch this video. But I mean, I'm not going to go into too much detail because it's really traumatizing. But essentially, Elizabeth spent a lot of her time hiding in plain sight, which I think is the scariest thing, because basically after she was kidnapped, Elizabeth was taken by Bryan Mitchell into the woods to an encampment outside of Salt Lake City, Utah. So at one point she was living in the woods of Salt Lake City, Utah, and she even had points where she heard search parties calling her name, but she couldn't do anything. And it's so scary. So once Elizabeth got to the area they were staying in the woods, Bryan Mitchell introduced her to Wanda Barzee. He was working with Bryan Mitchell as well, and Mitchell ended up raping Elizabeth Smart daily, sometimes several times a day for the time that she was in captivity, which is obviously so terrible. But there was even more things that she had to go through while she was being held captive. Bryan Mitchell was really insane, and he would say these insane thoughts to Elizabeth, and him and Wanda like would believe them. They basically would say that he was a god or an angel or something of the sort. He had the complete intent of kidnapping many different women, which he called virgin brides. He wanted to kidnap them and marry them likely. Basically it was him officiating a wedding, which he did to Elizabeth, but it's obviously not actually official. It's just him in his mind. And this actually came into play, the fact that he wanted to kidnap other people, because during her time there, Elizabeth kept talking about her cousin Olivia, who was a really close friend to her. She always felt like it was like one of her closest friends. At that point, something really terrifying happened in July of 2002. Wanda Barzee and Bryan Mitchell actually tried to kidnap Olivia Wright, which is Elizabeth Smart's cousin. However, the family heard someone breaking in and ended up calling the police. Barzee and Mitchell ended up escaping before the police got there. So it was unsuccessful, but it's just scary to imagine that her cousin could have been kidnapped just because she was talking about her. Obviously, it wouldn't be like her fault, but like that's just kind of scary in general. However, at the time, they believed that this break-in wasn't connected at all to the Elizabeth Smart case. It's interesting to think that they couldn't be further from the truth. Like, this was like all connected, but they just assumed that it was like a robbery or so, just some sort of break-in in general, and it had nothing to do with Elizabeth Smart, but it definitely did, and they obviously found that out much later when Elizabeth was found. To keep Elizabeth from escaping, they actually tied her to a tree with a metal cable that allowed her very limited mobility around the tree and woods area where they were staying. She was also given a new name, and she had a couple different aliases throughout her time, but it was mostly Esther, named after Esther of the Old Testament. Elizabeth was also forced to drink alcohol and do drugs, and also was starved a lot of the time during her captivity. In September of 2002, Mitchell, Barzee, and Elizabeth Smart relocated to San Diego, California. It was actually insane because back in Utah and all over the world, pretty much, people were searching for Elizabeth Smart. People have heard about this entire thing, yet she was literally hiding in plain sight. She would go out to places, like in fact, there's even photos of Elizabeth, Mitchell, and Barzee like all out and like walking the streets, and people would take photos of them because they looked really weird because they were dressed head to toe in like robes, and Elizabeth would have a veil over her face, obviously because the entire country pretty much knew what this girl looked like and were trying to find her, so they had her face completely veiled and headscarves and everything to protect her identity. There was even an instance that was it's just so heartbreaking to even hear this part, but in August of 2002, just 2 months after Elizabeth was kidnapped, this was before they left Salt Lake City, Utah, Elizabeth, Barzee, and Mitchell all visited the old Salt Lake City Public Library, where a bystander noticed their weird clothing and also were close enough to Elizabeth Smart to realize that it possibly was her. So the bystander called the police, and the police came to investigate. They confronted them, but Mitchell claimed that Elizabeth was his and Wanda Barzi's daughter, and that they could not remove their headpieces because it was due to their religion, which obviously wasn't true, but the police took it as like, okay. Elizabeth and Wanda did not speak at this time because Mitchell said to the police that it was prohibited in their religion for women to speak in public. So even though the officer was so close to getting Elizabeth into safety at this point, it didn't happen. And it's really sad, and Elizabeth has actually spoken out about this particular incident and said, quote, "I felt like hope was walking out the door. I was mad at myself that I didn't say anything. Mad at myself for not taking a chance. So close. I felt terrible that the detective hadn't pushed harder. He just walked away," end quote. Over the course of her captivity, she actually made several more appearances in the public. They would all go to grocery stores, they went to a restaurant, but they remained completely unnoticed. Elizabeth Smart even went to a party with Mitchell and Barzi and was photographed wearing a veil and a robe with Mitchell and another guest. So while this was all going on for Elizabeth over the course of 9 months, a lot was also going on at home with her investigation. So in October of 2002, Mary Catherine suddenly, literally miraculously realized that the abductor's voice that she had heard was the voice of a man named Emmanuel. So Emmanuel was an unemployed man who the family hired to work on the roof and rake leaves. The police were very skeptical at first because obviously this information is coming from a child, and obviously it's kind of weird that it was like months later that she just had this recollection that it was just Emmanuel, like that just like came to her. I just think it's so bizarre, but obviously you'll see in a bit that it ended up saving Elizabeth's life. Even though the police were skeptical, the family hired a sketch artist to draw a picture of Emmanuel's face based on their descriptions. So in February of 2003, this photo was released all over the media, and it was shown even on the Larry King Live show and also on America's Most Wanted. This photo was actually of Bryan David Mitchell because Bryan David Mitchell just had the alias of Emmanuel when he met the Smart family and when he raked their leaves and worked on their roof. The drawing was actually recognized by Bryan David Mitchell's family, and they gave him more pictures that were more like contemporary without his beard, because without his beard he literally looked like a completely different person, and I think that is why it was so difficult finding him. But these photos really did help the search continue. Finally, on March 12th, 2003, Bryan David Mitchell was spotted with 2 women in Sandy, Utah. They were spotted by a couple who saw Mitchell's photos on the news. The women were obviously Elizabeth Smart, who was actually disguised really weirdly. She was disguised in a gray wig and in sunglasses and a veil, and then also, of course, Wanda Barzi. So at this point, the police came. Elizabeth Smart even said to them, like, "I know you think I'm that Elizabeth Smart girl, but I'm not." And they were like looking at her face and they were like, "Yes, you are." But she was clearly so scared to say something to them, which I think is so sad. But luckily they this time investigated further and realized that it was definitely Elizabeth Smart, and Mitchell and Barzi were obviously arrested, and Elizabeth was finally able to return home to her family after 9 months in captivity. That is the story of Elizabeth Smart. It's obviously really, really heartbreaking, and it's just so lucky and so amazing that she ended up being completely safe and found alive, because like I said earlier, that doesn't always happen. But that is it for today's video. If you guys liked it, please give it a big thumbs up. Let me know in the comments what other people that you want me to talk about for this series. There's a lot of instances where people have been kidnapped but were found months or years later, and I just find it really interesting to talk about their stories, and also really important to spread awareness about their stories. So let me know in the comments below. But that is it. Make sure you follow me on Twitter, Snapchat, and Instagram, because I'm always posting really dope ass shit on there. Subscribe for new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday for conspiracy theories, and occasionally on Tuesdays and Thursdays I post vlogs or other videos. But yeah, that is it, and I will see you guys tomorrow. Bye.